I'm going to present on ideas and visions and strategies that come from different cities all over the world. I'm going to show Vancouver because I was chief planner there for 6 years. But everything I'm going to talk about, I have decided in my 26 years of doing this and working around the world, these are universal things. So do not get distracted by how the pictures I show you are different than Colorado Springs. And do not think for a minute that you can just write off my commentary because Vancouver, for example, is different from Colorado Springs. Of course it is, but that's not the point. The point is that in my observation, working in cities of every scale, on every continent, I have found that cities have a lot more in common than they do differences. So what I'm talking about are universal principles. Okay? So with that lead-in, I'm going to cram a whole bunch of information into the hour that I have with you, because as I've gone through this 24 hours, I've had additional epiphanies on what I need to say to you before I leave tomorrow. And I've had a lot of things where I've said something today, and my guests have said, "Can you be sure to say that tonight?" And I'm not sure I'm even going to remember them all, but I'm going to try to cram a lot in. So buckle up. I'm going to go fast. But hopefully at the end of this, we'll have a good conversation in a Q&A context about what this all means for your city. So, and by the way, if you are tweeting, this is how you find me. And if you want to know anything about what I think, just read every tweet I've ever written, and it will give you all the information you need. Oh, see? It's sensitive. So when I come into a city, or when I'm talking about any city, it's usually in the context of all sorts of different positions for cities, from success or failure. I've observed that you are a pretty successful city, and you have a lot going for you right now. So I have a lot of compliments that I could share in terms of your relative positioning, even compared with some of your competitive cities. But every city is facing these issues in some way, or should be. If they're not paying attention to these things, they should be. How climate change relates specifically to how we build cities, public health and how it connects to how we build our cities and suburbs, housing affordability, unpredictable energy costs. I used to say rising energy costs, but now it's not clear what energy costs are going to do, so the unpredictability makes it hard to plan. Aging and changing population. I used to say aging population, but now as cities are trying to all fight for the millennials, it's not just about the aging population, it's how you support and attract that other generation that is the largest generation on planet Earth right now. And as you grow and as you change, how to maintain your civic identity, your culture, what makes you special, and not just the same as every place else. Every city I know is facing these challenges in some way or other. Climate change and the direct connection between how we build our cities and how cities are going to actually be the solution of climate change has been well understood around the world, as far as I can see, for quite a while. America was behind on that until Sandy. And that was a bit of a game-changing moment, I found, in my work with American cities, because now there was a connecting of the dots. Lately, you've had a bit of a backslide on this, at least at the federal level in your country. But your cities still get this. Your cities still understand that how you build cities, how you build buildings, and how you build mobility is the critical element to addressing climate change. If you're not motivated by that and you don't listen to climate scientists, which you should, then maybe doctors will get your attention. Probably the most significant voice in the conversation about how we build cities and suburbs are the public health professionals these days. They are game changers because, frankly, I like to joke that we're all trained to listen to our doctors more than we're trained maybe to listen to our city planners, and more so than to our climate scientists. But when public health care professionals are connecting the dots overtly, but with how we build our cities and suburbs and the public health implications, both as individuals, as society, and the huge public cost associated with preventable diseases that are directly connected to how we build our cities, and particularly our suburbs, then that gets everyone's attention. I've certainly observed your incredibly interesting, I'll put that in quotes, debate and dialogue about public health care systems. We have a different one in Canada, as you know. But how you actually save public money relative to how you design your communities is a pretty powerful game changer in the conversation. As an example, in Canada, the 4 public healthcare officers of 4 regions around the Greater Toronto area held a press conference to talk about building in exercise into our daily lives and in our cities, talking about walking, cycling, public transit, and how it addresses chronic disease. And they got a ton of press. And I joked at the time that if the 4 chief planners of those regions had called a press conference, nobody would have come. But when the doctors did it, it got a lot of attention. And these are my probably greatest allies lately in this conversation about how to build cities. And they're also my clients. I've worked in about 9 Australian cities in the last few years. I've particularly worked in 5 where my client is not the state level of government, the local level of government. It's the Heart Foundation of Australia, who have hired me to come in and convince governments to change the way they think about planning physical structures in their city, mobility in their city, etc., because they recognize it's probably the most important thing they could do for preventative disease. This is an interesting change in the conversation that's happened relatively recently. And by the way, they put out great documents like Does Density Matter? The Role of Density in Creating Walkable Neighborhoods. You can download this. It's online. You should, but I'll give away the ending for you. It matters. It matters a lot. If you're not motivated by climate change or public health, maybe money motivates you. A lot of the conversation we had today about the exploding trend in city building about doing better math. And Canada has been the leader on this, Canadian cities, doing the full cost accounting of different decisions about where you grow, the patterns of growth, infill versus suburban, density changes, slight changes in ratio of growth in one place or another, changes in density units per acre, and the effect it has on public infrastructure costs. Because the assumption is, well, developers pay for that. No, they don't. They certainly don't pay for life cycle costs. And so cities are doing studies and putting the results on the front page of the newspaper in Canada and now in Australia because of the work I'm doing there, and hopefully more so in the United States, about the cost, the price tag of different ways of growing. And in this case, just a slight change in the ratio of how much of the projected growth of a city going into infill versus new greenfield suburban growth was a conservative estimate of $3 billion. And this is a small community. This community is about half the size of Colorado Springs. So it's larger here. And they don't even have the challenges you have around water supply and such. So what I found, I like this conversation. I say that cities and suburbs are changing, and the conversation is changing faster than I've seen previously in my career, not because of an ideology about where people should be living, but because we're doing better math. And once you know these numbers, it's hard to unknow them. It's hard to unring this bell. And I say it's powerful because whether you're so-called fiscal conservative or liberal, whether you're right-wing or left-wing, this gets your attention. Money gets your attention because of all the other things you could spend money on if you weren't wasting it on excessively expensive infrastructure tied to how you're choosing to grow. So it's a game changer. If you think technology is going to save you, you're wrong. I even had that conversation today with someone whose name I will not mention. But the conversation was about, well, aren't automated vehicles just going to fix this whole problem for us? No, it won't. There's a good chance, based on the ownership model, that automated vehicles are actually going to make this problem worse. That there's going to be more driving and less public transit, walking and biking, etc. So the jury's out on how long it's actually going to take for this technology to become ubiquitous. And the experts I listen to say it's going to take a lot longer than the boosters say. But even if it happens quickly or slowly, the real question is, what are the consequences for cities? Every time we've ever made an improvement in cars, for example, it's led to more driving, which has wiped out the gains that the technological improvement actually helped you realize. So if technology is not going to save the day for us, demographics might. So I hinted at this relative to the aging and changing population. The millennials, the second largest demographic group in human history, the largest currently on planet Earth because the baby boomers have started to pass on, the front end of the baby boomers, are frankly what every city in at least North America and increasingly around the world are fighting to attract for purposes of economic development. That was happening even before the big hubbub about the second headquarters of Amazon got everyone's attention. And what millennials want are either initially urban places where they can walk, bike, and take public transit, where they have cool, funky stuff that they want. And then as they age, they want places that can accommodate families as they start to move into that stage of their life. Or they will take suburbs, but they don't want car-dependent suburbs. They want multimodal choices. They want suburbs where you can walk, bike, and take public transit. And the cities that offer that will win the millennials. Their parents, the baby boomers, are increasingly also wanting the same things. The Wall Street Journal called this demographic the broken hipsters. If you're insulted by that, don't blame me, blame the Wall Street Journal. It's a tongue-in-cheek way of suggesting that the baby boomers are making decisions that we would normally attribute to the so-called hipsters. They want walkable urban neighborhoods for various reasons. They don't want to be car-dependent because they do want to be active, or they get to a place where they actually can't drive anymore, which is going to be the case for everyone. But in a most immediate sense, they want to be in a neighborhood with their kids and grandkids, which is actually driving a lot of the conversation about where the boomers go. So the two largest demographic groups in human history are fighting it out for the urban places that we aren't building very much of, because we're still tending to build suburban growth. And the boomers are winning because they have all the money. They're outbidding their own kids. Or they're buying houses for their kids, which is a nicer thing to do if you're a parent, I suppose. But the point is, we've got an incredible demographic tailwind. There is no reason. All the studies and surveys show this is what the public and the largest demographic groups actually want. And yet we continue for various reasons, including momentum, to build something else, usually car-dependent things. The demographic group in the middle, which is the age groups that are starting families, the typical narrative is that as soon as they start to have kids and go from a double income, no kids, to a family, they can't move fast enough out of the urban places and move to the suburbs where they can raise a family. That is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We've been designing urban places, and that presumes our urban places even have housing, because you're only, for example, getting into the business of building housing in your downtown and your urban places. But the self-fulfilling prophecy is families don't want to live in urban places, so we won't design for families, and thus we could create the self-fulfilling prophecy because the families don't come. And we say, see, we told you, families don't want to live in urban places. In Vancouver, in our downtown, we have 7,000 kids, which is 6,800 more than we had a couple of decades ago. There's nothing magic in the water. We designed specifically for families. We regulated to make sure that development fit and accommodated families. So talk about it right here. This is, almost everything I can tell you at one point I put into a tweet. Want families and kids downtown? You have to ensure that you have actual homes that can fit families, 2- and 3-bedroom homes in the context of urban places. You need to ensure you have daycare, schools, and supports to support family living, and you need to design the public realm in a way that is good for kids, because as we say, if it works for kids, it works for everyone. I've been looking around your downtown for evidence of families. In other words, I was looking for kids. We saw some weird photo shoot going on in a back alley with a kid sitting forlorn. I'm not sure what they were trying to say in that photo shoot, but I didn't see a lot of kids in my 24 hours here, and that could be an accident, but usually in some places I can't not see them. There's so many of them. Certainly that's the case in Vancouver. The narrative was true in Vancouver, too, initially. Families don't want to live downtown, until we designed families for downtown. But many cities have been designing downtowns to virtually repel families. So you've done a good job of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The message is that even this demographic group in the middle will choose urban places if you design for them. So again, what's our excuse for not achieving this kind of success in urban places like your downtown, but also in your transit corridors and other places where urbanism and density are being contemplated? I took this picture a bit cheeky because I know that this is a certain kind of use, a religious-related kind of use. I just like this. I want to steal that line because what we're really talking about is housing downtown, new life downtown. Housing, if there's no such thing as a silver bullet for how to strengthen downtowns, but if there was, it would be housing. Because you're creating body heat, you're creating customers, you're creating a high-density community. And you can decide specifically that you want that new population to include families. Vancouver was probably the first city of the modern era, unlike cities like San Francisco and New York that had been around for a long time, to build an urban downtown in the relatively modern era. And at the time, the narrative was, no one wants to live downtown, let alone families. So we have about 60,000 more people in the downtown since we started doing this, and we have, as I said, 7,000 kids. So that brings new life downtown. I usually start with these slides earlier, but I'll put them in now. I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of things, and at some point you're going to be thinking what I call the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language. We could never do that in our city. I've already gotten a bit of that in the 24 hours. Oh, Brent, don't you understand? Here we have fill in the blank. It's amazing how much energy goes into, when I start to work in cities, I get excitement, I get inspiration and passion. I also get excuse. Don't you know we have climate / market / flatness / you name it, politics / ideology / whatever it is, to explain why the things I talk about can't work here. So catch yourself thinking that. And I wonder if you're going to ask me questions that might be very cleverly worded, but are really just saying that. What I find, and because I work in some of the poorest cities in the world, some of the richest cities in the world, cities that have way more challenges and much bigger challenges than you have, what I actually find is this is the key. The cities that have a clear vision and the will and skill to make it happen with an emphasis on follow-through, instead of a culture of excuse, are the ones that are achieving things. That is what, it's not climate, it's not topography, it's not market strength, it's not any of that. It's this. So do you have it or not? I also find that when I'm working with cities trying to get to better results, I've come up with this over some years, describing what I call the stages of smart planning. You start off doing the wrong thing, and in many cases, you're in still this stage, in some cases. Then you evolve to doing the wrong thing better, and you can spend decades in that stage. And the example is you're still building interchanges, but you're building them with some sidewalks and walkable infrastructure. I've heard a lot about that here. Driverless cars are an example of doing the wrong thing better. And to be clear, I give some credit for doing the wrong thing better. I'm a glass half full person, I'm an optimist. If you're going to do the wrong thing, you might as well do it better. But never mistake that for doing the right thing. Never mistake that for where you want to be. Then you can be in an era of trying to have your cake and eat it too. You're investing in transit, you're building bike lanes, but you're also widening your roads at the same time and wondering why you're not getting mode shift. I think you're there in some contexts and some issues. And then in some cases, you might be actually doing the right thing. This is not meant to be an absolute. You're not absolutely and all-encompassing way in one particular stage. You can actually think about where you are on almost an issue-by-issue basis. Someone in my last talk in the last city I was working with last year yelled out, "We're still in number 2." And I said, well, you might be on some issues, but you might be in number 3 in others. You might still be right back here, not even doing the right thing better. Another simple example of that is still building big box retailing and suburban style car dependent shopping, but you invest in some nicer landscaping in the parking lot. So it's nicer to theoretically get from your car to the front of the store. That's doing the wrong thing better, slightly better. Vancouver gets a lot of attention. It's an it city. It's amazing the kinds of things you can be ranked on and lauded for when you start to get on a roll in terms of being a successful city. Some of them are goofy, top coffee city, some of them are great in terms of livable and reputable and visitable. This is the one that's important. There's absolutely nothing that I'm talking about that is ideological or airy-fairy or, gee, this is about morals and ethics, although it is. The point is that you don't have to make the false choice trade between doing smart planning and smart design and being so-called open for business. Vancouver is one of the most successful cities in the world, to the point where we've got an affordability crisis when it comes to city building. And we've got one of the most resilient city building markets. We were the only city in North America that really was relatively untouched by the 2008 downturn. We called it a downturn. You called it a recession. It wasn't even really a downturn in Vancouver. All of this is got a business case associated with it. I learned that the importance of that working in conservative cities, where you have to make the business case. The benefit, the truth of this, the benefit I have is that everything I talk about has a demonstrated business case associated with it. It's not about whether you want to be a nicer city. Do you want to be a more successful city? And again, that breaks through the polarization that places tend to have, in America particularly so, around so-called left and so-called right. This is so-called smart or so-called dumb. That's what this is about. So I wanted to make that point relative to comparisons of other places. And to emphasize that point, I spent 6 years as Vancouver chief planner. Before that, I spent 6 years as one of the chief planners, one of the top planners in Calgary. Calgary is often referred to as the most American of Canadian cities. It's kind of like Denver with a bit of Dallas thrown in. The ideology, the language at the time when I was hired was planning is bad, get out of the way, market knows best, get off my lawn. It's all that kind of similar narrative that you hear in places that want small government and individual rights. So Calgary has become an it city in urban design, in smart city making, even in sustainability. They've got buildings being designed by some of the top architects on the planet, and public realm like the Calatrava pedestrian and cycling bridge. Urban design and the importance of designing things well has become part of the DNA. They've had a sea change in their approach to intervening in the marketplace and achieving a better city. And they have because of the business case, not because they think it's better for the planet, it's better for the bottom line. And I say that if this city, which is very much like your ideology, can understand and do many of the things that Vancouver has done, frankly, in some cases better than Vancouver has, but do it because this is good for business, it kind of makes the point that this is not a right versus left thing, this is a smart versus dumb thing. And if you're not motivated by that example, I spent about 2 years advising the city of Medellin, Colombia, which is one of the poorest cities on the planet. It was also the murder capital of the world in the 1990s. This was the home of Pablo Escobar and the drug trade and guerrilla warfare. People were literally being murdered on a regular basis for just walking in the streets. And they transformed their city. It was been called the Medellin Miracle. And particularly transforming their transportation, often in the context of a conversation about equity and equal access and fair access to the city, no matter your economic status. Bus rapid transit, light rail, even repurposing ski chalet cable cars to use as public transit in the hills. You may have seen images. It's become quite famous for this kind of thing. And even escalators to facilitate more walkability in the context of radical slopes. And often cities tell me, but Brent, we're not flat, we have slopes. Well, you don't have this kind of slope. And doing it cheaply, because this kind of technology is actually remarkably inexpensive when you compare it to bigger expensive stuff, and doing it fast, within years, a few years, not within decades. And creating and then taking back their public spaces and public life because that people were literally afraid to be in them in previous years. And then when they called me, there was the conversation about how we get increased pedestrianization because people were still afraid, not of being murdered, but of being hit by a car, because the car traffic was so horrible and the infrastructure had been designed almost entirely around the car. And they said to me, Brent, how do we make that change? And I said, well, here's what you need to do. And they said, the car companies are too powerful. They will never let us do that. And I said, you're the city that took on Pablo Escobar and you're afraid of the car companies? But what this city shows is that you can make a powerful transformation in much harder contexts than Colorado Springs has. If you think your politics are dangerous, you don't know dangerous. And I say if they can do it, you can do it. So how do you get to a culture of being inspired by these kind of cities and frankly doing more faster? In the context of Vancouver, this is the pace and rate of change that can happen in just one generation. This is 1983 to 2003. I've got a similar one going to 2013. But it shows how much change, how much city building can actually happen in just one generation. And then the question is, does your value system deliver a good city or a bad city in that relatively fast period of time? Do not be freaked out by the tall buildings and such if you don't like tall buildings. That's not the point. The point is how these buildings land and create urban communities with a strong value system around people and multimodal thinking within a downtown context. But I show it to say, you can do a lot of change within a relatively short period of time. If you've got a reasonably hot market, you've got a reasonably hot market. And you can transform your downtown in just one generation. But that's Vancouver's downtown. This is the rest of the city, which is much more low density, and the rest of the region even. And there in the established neighborhoods is where the conversation about growth and change and density is much harder. The politics of it are harder. The community conversations are much harder. And then you go even beyond to the suburbs, and then things get really hard. But it's where it is in the suburbs that the conversation so dramatically needs to improve. Because as I say, the success or failure of our city regions, in your context you have one, in my context I had 21 separate municipalities fragmenting my regional context, with Vancouver as the center city. Our city region's success or failure, and ultimately our survival when you factor in things like climate change and public health epidemics, etc., depends on how well we do our suburbs. My hosts understand that. I was brought in by a downtown association, but they invited and asked me to talk about everything, to talk about the whole city. That's very important because we all should know that the downtown is incredibly important to the success of the city, whether you ever choose to come downtown or not. It is very important to the success of your city and your success and your family's success. It is also true, though, that probably the most important thing, one of the most important things affecting the health of your downtown is how you build the rest of your city, including your suburbs, which is where the majority of your growth goes. Has gone and will continue to grow. I'm not against suburbia. I'm not one of those urbanists who uses suburb and sprawl interchangeably. I know that there's a difference, but far too much of your suburbia is sprawl. And that's what needs to change. You don't have to stop your suburbs, but you need to stop your sprawl. And as simple a definition as I can give is sprawl is auto-dependent. Where you have only one rational choice on how to get around, and that's the car, you are living in sprawl. If you have choices, dare I say freedom, because I know that word is big here in the United States, to actually make other decisions, make other choices, isn't that better? And we can build suburbs that have choices, that are multimodal, maybe still predominantly car, but other rational choices. Then you're not necessarily building sprawl. You're building a different kind of suburb. We need to build better inner city infill, and we need to build a different kind of suburb. Or you get this. Not to scare you, but in the context of Metro Vancouver, this is the kind of transformations that are happening in our suburbs. A former greenfield shopping center with a sea of parking around it, Investment in this case, elevated light rail, but whatever it is, bus rapid transit, or even just a frequent transit network where your buses are running with a 10-minute headway, for example. You can start to transform that suburban experience here into something that is high density, mixed use. It's urban. Not just in your downtown, but in actually your former suburban places. The interesting thing about this, which is a project that's just about finished, I'm going to be able to replace these drawings with a photo soon, is that everything you see in the foreground, except for these shadowed in towers, everything you see in the foreground here, all of that urbanism, is in the parking lot of the mall. You haven't even touched the mall yet. Phase 2 is over the mall, which just goes to show you how much land we waste when we're building suburban shopping centers. So how you start to transform the suburban experience and make some of it more urban. And as you're planning transit corridors, in your case, rapid high-frequency bus, and ultimately maybe something like BRT or even light rail, the kind of density and forms that you build along that linear urbanism, you can start to combine your land use thinking and your density with your transit ridership aspirations and do something that's coordinated. It's a big conversation I had with your staff today about how to do that better. When you're talking about density, though, a lot of cities and a lot of citizens tend to try to attack the conversation in saying, well, if you're talking about density, you must be interested in developer profit. And if you're a planner, a city planner talking about density, you must be in the pockets of developers. I've heard of that kind of narrative a lot of times. I created this slide when I was chief planner of Vancouver because I wanted to go out community by community. In one case, in a month, I went to 52 community meetings to talk about why we're even talking about density at all. And most importantly, how to do density in a good way and not in a bad way. All the public interest things, from reduced energy use in buildings, reduced energy use in transit, more green design options like geothermal and district energy, which are game changers in terms of climate change, that are only possible with higher densities. Less pressure on agricultural land, on aquifer land for your water supply, wetlands, whatever your interests are, even industrial land out on your urban edge, more affordable housing choices, improved public health in the preventable disease sense, almost every way you can measure vitality, even safety, incidence of crime. Densification, if you do it well, works better. It outperforms low density. Those are all public interest reasons. None of this has to do with how much profit a developer makes. I could care less how much developer profit there is, as long as there's enough that developers will actually build the things we need to actually achieve these public outcomes. But you see my point? There needs to be a conversation about the public interest reasons why densification, why growth, is a good thing in solving our public interest challenges. If we do it well, and then the conversation shifts to how we do it well. How am I doing for time? Okay. So, how do you do density well? It's easy to say that line, but what does it mean? The first thing is about how you do your land use and your mobility. And as I said, there needs to still be improvement, I think, in the alignment and organization of that here in Colorado Springs. If you grow in a way that is car dependent, if you add more population and expect those people to drive, that's a recipe for failure. You can actually decrease your quality of life. You get all the things that people tend to picture when they think about density if they're against density. If you design for cars, that's what happens. So you design for multimodal city building. The first recognition is that if you try to do it by widening roads, the bigger roads you make, the more traffic you actually generate. This is something that is lately better understood because people like me and Chuck are beating it like a drum. And the black box of the old traffic models have been broken open, and this information has been democratized. We can all talk about it. But in the old days, the answer was if you have congestion, if you have traffic, if your streets are busy, the answer is widen roads. And a politician gets a ribbon cutting, and for 5 minutes it might help things. And then people drive more. And the roads fill up, and you get exactly the same levels of congestion that you had before. And you folks have really wide roads already, by the way. Some of the widest roads I've ever seen. So you know you can't do it by widening roads, but you can do a huge amount of damage to your city by trying to solve congestion through wider roads. Vancouver is the only city in North America, the only major city in North America, that has no freeways, that has no interchanges, that has none of that kind of infrastructure within the city limits. And our traffic works better. I'm going to explain what that means. But this is where the freeways would have gone. They would have decimated low-income neighborhoods, stable low-income neighborhoods, with a lot of heritage and a lot of history in them. They would have lobotomized the waterfronts of Vancouver, which are our best places in the city, just like they lobotomized the waterfront in Seattle. You pick a city that has freeways, chances are it wiped out connections to the waterfront, because that tends to be where the freeways went. It would have cut through our best natural space, our Central Park, if you will, if you know New York's Central Park. It would have done huge damage to our city in order to try to accommodate accessing vehicle trips from the suburbs. Thankfully, it wasn't the engineers or the city planners who came to their senses, it was people who rallied against it, particularly the demolition of these low-income, stable neighborhoods. And they stopped the freeways. And that probably, well, I say it is the most important decision Vancouver ever made. Everything that is successful about Vancouver flowed from the decision to not build freeways. And the so-called Vancouver model, or Vancouverism, that came out of it all started with this answer no. And we've been talking about how you have a confidence to say no to things that aren't good enough for your city. For us, it started with saying the biggest no we ever said. And that taught us to say no to things that weren't good ideas for our city. It's very hard sometimes for politicians to say no to things, even when there's a track record of failure associated with those kinds of things. We've known since 1955 this statement, which nobody has said better than Lewis Mumford back in 1955. Adding highway lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. In America, the new urbanists try to take the credit for this phrase. Mumford said it back in 1955. We've known that long, and nobody's said it better, in my opinion, since. And yet we've tried over and over again, spent billions of dollars of money trying to prove this wrong, and it's right. It's inherently right. Now, cool cities all over the world are tearing down their freeways and infrastructures. I joke that Vancouver doesn't get to be part of this cool club because we never built them in the first place. And all the cool kids are doing this now, tearing down their urban freeways. Seoul, Korea is an inspiration for many cities because they tore down an urban freeway bisecting their urban center and built this, which is the best public space, the #1 tourist attraction in the city. The coolest thing about this scenario, the most important thing about this scenario, is that when they did this, tearing down the freeway and building this, the traffic got better. The traffic got better. I want to make sure that really sinks in. Because people changed their behavior, trips changed into different kinds of trips, and a lot of the actual bottlenecks that were being created went away. Traffic got better. So it's a false choice between planning for the car or planning for people. You can do both, but your emphasis always should be planning for people. A lot of cities are realizing that if you really want to progress, it's not just starting doing the right things, which is the easy part. It's actually stopping doing the wrong things, which I pointed out to your staff and politicians is often the hard part. You know, doing this gets you credit. It wins you awards. You get written up in the paper. When you stop doing the wrong things, you get angry developers calling you and complaining. You get angry citizens who are used to something. You get rarely any credit for stopping doing the wrong things. But it's often this that's more important than this. And then you can take the next progressive step and actually fix the mistakes you made in the first place, like tearing down your freeways or putting your streets and your incredibly wide roads on road diets, and actually building new things in the space that you're wasting with excessively wide roads. My clients in Medellin, this was the freeways that were being built, or had been built, that literally are choking, or figuratively I suppose, choking the river and disconnecting the city to the riverway. We couldn't get, the only piece of advice I gave them that they didn't follow because they couldn't, was to just get rid of these freeways and traffic would adjust and reinvest in public transit. They couldn't do that because these were federal freeways and they were controlled by the federal government, so they didn't have that power. So instead, lobbied for money to build overpasses, essentially, pedestrian and public space overpasses to connect the downtown with the river. And this first phase is just about finished in Medellin. My clients this is one of the poorest cities in the world. My clients in one of the richest cities in the world, Oslo, Norway, did the same thing. They had a freeway disconnecting their downtown from the fjord, and they had a plan to reconnect the fjord to the city and make it the public asset that it really should be. Once again, they didn't get rid of it, they buried it. But what they found is that when you build this, which is an entirely new urban neighborhood with office space and housing and civic facilities and cultural facilities, remarkable stuff, and building a multimodal boulevard that has trams and bus lanes, dedicated bus lanes, and widened sidewalks and separated bike lanes, a multimodal boulevard, plus all the other stuff they built in the space that the freeway used to take. They achieve all this, plus the interesting thing is this multimodal boulevard actually moves more people than the old freeway used to. Not more cars, more people. As soon as you realize the job of transportation in cities is to move people, not cars, you can actually move much more people with much less space, have the leftover space to build a whole community. And by the way, you're addressing climate change, public health, public costs, etc., all at the same time. So why not do that? The engineers in Vancouver know that what the planners know, which is that when you're planning transportation, getting your land use right is actually the key. Our engineers even say the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. This is why I've been so interested today in the connection between your comp plan, you call it, your comprehensive plan, which is well advanced, and your transportation plan, which is just in the starting point. How those two things are going to align, recognizing that the decisions you make around land use are the most important thing for your actual mobility and transportation. That's going to be a really important challenge for you folks as you try to align these things when they are out of step, out of sync. In our transportation plan, which was built in Vancouver after what I don't call it, my predecessors called the years of the Warlords, where the transportation engineers and the city planners were fighting for supremacy on who controlled City Hall. That battle is still going on in city halls all over North America. It was the 1997 transportation plan that was planned, written by traffic engineers and city planners with a common definition of success to build a great city, not move cars, build a great city. That really led to a culture which at the time, we coined the term plangineers, which has now become a popular hashtag. But what it was at the time was a culture where land use and transportation were thought of as one conversation. One of the most important things that transportation plan did, and it's the first one I've seen that did it, was not balance ways of getting around. That's commonly the kind of language used in transportation plans and land use plans, and I call that code for the status quo, only slightly better. Because rarely, if I look into the details, do I actually see any real sense of balance, but it's a way of saying, here's some stuff for walking, biking, and transit, but we're still going to prioritize the car. It's still trying to have your cake and eat it too. What Vancouver did was said, no, there's no balance, there's priority. Walking is first, then cycling, then transit, then goods movement for all sorts of things that goods movement are important for, and then the car. We rarely ban the car, we prioritize it last. And the interesting thing is when you do this, it's not an anti-car message. When you do this, you move much more people with less space, with better public outcomes, and the driving actually can get better. You can actually move more people with less infrastructure, and the driving can get better. Vancouver, we actually have less congestion than we had in the 1970s because we built a multimodal city. And it's easy to understand because everyone's not fighting for a finite amount of space with large objects, their cars. You can move many more people with less space because there's less competition for that space. So this is the most important urban design and city building policy we ever crafted in Vancouver, and it's technically considered a transportation policy. But what it is a city building policy. critically important. I've helped cities, a number of cities, build this kind of thing into their plans. This is Medellin, where we built it into both the land use plan and the transportation plan. So here's the Spanish version if you speak Spanish. But building it into your policy is really, really important, but that's the easy part. Does it change culture? Does it change real decisions downstream, or is it just a nice thing to put into your plan to help you win an award from the Planning Association, but you haven't really changed anything? And I started to work for cities where they would ask me to look at the follow-through. And the most important follow-through is the budget. And so I started saying this: the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision statement, it's found in its budget. It's also found in its space allocation. If you're not willing to rethink how wide your roads are right now, because of course you couldn't possibly adjust anything away from a car priority, then that's the truth, no matter what you've put in your active transport policies around balancing or prioritizing. By the way, on the note of balance, I always say, even if your goal is balance, not prioritization, which it should be in urban places, even if your goal is balance, you're in a 100-yard dash race and you gave the car an 80-yard head start. So by definition, if your goal is balance, now you've got to prioritize the other modes until at least they catch up. So even if your goal is balance, you need to prioritize. When we're planning and when smart cities are planning this priority, walking is first. How you design not just your horizontal, but your vertical interface. This is downtown Vancouver, the residential edge conditions we see. You've got all sorts of different edge conditions, retail, housing, etc. It's the quality of the street wall, the city at eye level at 5 kilometers an hour, that give you something interesting to treat your pedestrians to, because they made the good decision to walk. This is in Brisbane, Australia, where I've worked. This is a restaurant that externalized its kitchen to give a little bit of street theater for these folks to be able to see in. And I joke, hopefully there's nothing going on in there that you can see that would make you lose your appetite. But the most interesting thing about this example is this is a convention center in downtown Brisbane. I don't need to tell you, I think, that convention centers are usually the worst buildings in a downtown. They're big VCRs that land with blank walls to all the streets, killing all the street edge conditions all over, all around them. So when I see this kind of thing in the edge condition of a convention center, they get bonus points for me because it's usually horrible. This is also Brisbane, one of the deadest edge corners in downtown Brisbane. Transformed relatively easy by taking one of the coolest restaurants and giving them the permission to do a container shop on the edge condition. Went from the worst intersection in the downtown to probably the best in terms of just how much activity is constantly going on at that intersection. Fast, cheap, easy. Just had to say yes. Here's an edge condition in Göteborg, Sweden, where I've worked, where they built a nightclub out of containers that looked at the dead space created by an edge condition along a surface parking lot, which tend to be really bad things for walkability because they're dead and boring, and give it life, give it vitality, including this kind of social experience right at the end. You know, here's an example from your own context. A nice old historic building, but not with an active edge condition, with a pop-up insertion that gives it some vitality and edge. So you get this, you're just not doing it a lot. You could be doing a lot more than you're doing, and you have your own inspiration to learn from. In New York, they broke down the street wall edge condition into all of its elements to make sure they understood it better, and building wall ground, recognizing you're creating a real urban room. This is the most organized approach that I've seen, and yet they're not implementing it. So it's very well done and pretty much useless. Whereas in Vancouver, we didn't do anything nearly this intense, but we're implementing a very simple policy: no blank walls. The most important, I've seen some blank walls in your downtown. So how do you retroactively address that? That's an interesting conversation, but don't build any more of them. No blank walls along your street edge if you want walkability. And then you can talk about how your street is a place not just to move through, from a pedestrian perspective, not a car perspective, but a pedestrian perspective, but a place to actually linger in and love and people watch, where you can start to measure how long people stay in a space instead of how many people move through it as a definition of success. We built that into our new transportation plan in Vancouver, and at the time I called it Sticky Streets, to talk about how if you create a great place, it's sticky in the sense not because of gum on the street, which I know is a really big deal in downtowns, but I'm talking about just slowing you down. It can be window design, it can be transparency into a kitchen, it can be all sorts of different things. Patios are my favorite. And how that can create an opportunity for you to people watch. You've got some of the widest streets I've ever seen, and yet you haven't given much space for this kind of thing. Ironically, you've built a lot of interesting, I'm not going to completely attack them, but they're certainly clunky, and they've taken up a lot of space in your sidewalk. I would rather you had given that space to things like this. And you've got the space to do a lot of this. Because not only do you have incredibly wide carriageways, you've got incredibly wide sidewalks in most cases. So you could be doing a lot of this, and yet, because it's tight here, because you prioritized angled parking instead of parallel parking, you don't have much room for this. You could build a lot more of this, and your streets could be a lot better for people than they are. You don't even have the excuse that many other cities have, which is that we just don't have much space. You have a ton of it. When we did the Olympics in leading up to 2010, we wanted to use the Olympics as another catalyst for transforming mobility. We actually had to drop car use during the 17 days of the Olympics by an extra 30%. I say an extra 30% because we were already the lowest car use city in North America. So we had all the low-hanging fruit had been done. So how do we get to a deeper dropping of car use by 30% through walking, biking, and public transit? And then we challenged ourselves even more, because on top of that drop we had to do, and that's for VIP lanes and moving athletes around the region, you got to dedicate lanes for IOC use when you're holding the Olympics, hosting the Olympics. On top of that, we wanted to have a great civic celebration and transform our streets. Sydney, up till that time, had the reputation for the most fun Olympics ever held. Those Aussies know how to throw a party. We wanted to have at least the best Winter Olympics ever held, the most fun. So we wanted to transform a lot of our public realm into spaces for civic celebration, on top of already dropping car use by 30%. And the success, we actually dropped it by 28%, which was close enough. The important thing is half that transformation stayed after the 17 days were done, because we used the Olympics as a catalyst for mode shift. That's 10 or 15 years of regular mode shift transformation that we achieved in 17 days because of how we leveraged the Olympics for mode shift, for mobility transformation. At the time, I said that the Olympics was the largest traffic trial, if you know what a traffic trial is, a pilot, a way to show the public that you could transform mobility in your city, to prove to them that it works. I called the 17-day event the largest traffic trial in North American history, to show that you could do mobility differently. And you could do placemaking differently, because all those streets and such we closed down for civic celebration, many of them, at least seasonally during the summer, we still close down every summer through a program we call Viva Vancouver, which you can Google. I'm not saying we have, and the Olympic Transportation Plan, the key to it was to maintain that mode shift. It didn't do us any good if that mode shift only lasted 17 days. We wanted it to transform the city. And the civic celebration culture was dramatic. I won't lie to you and say that's the party we had every single day of the 17 days. That was the last day of the Olympics when we beat the United States in overtime to win the hockey gold medal. Or as we like to call it, the best moment in human history. You folks are proud to be Americans. This was actually has been cited sociologically as the coming out party for Canadian pride. Nationalism, if you will. We showed the flag. And it's because we beat you, so sorry. We needed it more than you did. Hockey is our thing. Sorry. You have lots of things. We only have one, hockey. But the cool thing about that transformation during the Olympics is we closed down whole lanes of traffic in some of our bridge accesses into the downtown, and the world didn't end. So our new transportation plan has put this into the plan, and that's going to be constructed. A multimodal boulevard in the middle of the bridge. We closed the viaducts, which are the only little piece of freeway infrastructure that we ever built in anticipation of the freeways that never came. It's basically just to address a rise from low to high to get into the downtown. But we closed them and the world didn't end. So I used that as the basis for an idea competition called Reconnect, where we invited ideas on how to reuse or transform the viaducts. We got 140 submissions from I think 13 countries, and we plastered them all over the front pages of all of the media to make the point that, to put it into the public mindset, that these things that we assume we need, because once you build car infrastructure, people are going to be absolutely convinced that you cannot take that away without the world ending. So we closed them for 17 days and the world didn't end. Then we closed them for 2 weeks during the filming of the movie Deadpool. Do you know this movie? If you watch that movie again, they have big battle scenes on a freeway. And it's not really a freeway, it's our viaduct. And so we closed them down again and the world didn't end again. And then council made the decision that we're tearing them down. And we're building a park, and we're building a multimodal boulevard, and we're doing a whole bunch of city making in the space that used to be taken up by the freeways, by the viaducts, while reconnecting neighborhoods because of the barrier that they represent. And all of those public spaces that we activated during the Olympics, now we activate, as I say, every summer through our programs, all sorts of different pilot approaches, and many of them are, now we plan them. We talked about, do you need to get rid of the curb on day one? I don't care. We've been closing down key street links for 8 years since the Olympics, and only now are we deciding, we've proven that it works well enough that now there's going to be a redesign, and it's going to become a permanent plaza. But every summer they were closed down for civic life. The next priority is cycling. I'm not going to go deeply into cycling. There might be some in the audience that are passionate about urban cycling. I'm not going to go really deep into it, except to say that if you want to have any chance of mode shift for urban biking, you need to separate your infrastructure, which you're doing in some cases, but you don't have a complete network at this point. This is the kind of separated infrastructure we've been building for the last 7 or so years in Vancouver. We're the first North American city to get to double digits in bike mode share. We just hit 10% of trips, which is really, really impressive by North American standards, and gets a polite laugh from my Scandinavian clients when I'm there, because they're in the 30s and 40s. But it's a big deal in North America. And the important thing for us is we combine the mode share of walking, biking, and transit, because we think multimodally, and that's the highest in North America as well. This is our first urban separated bike lane. Trust me when I say when we built the first one, there were not that many cyclists. We've talked about that a lot today. If you build your separated bike lane, one bike lane at a time, not creating a minimum network, you're doing what I call pulling the Band-Aid off slowly. You build one every year. There's always controversy. The media asks you, why aren't there more cyclists? The answer is because we don't have a complete network. And the media asks you, are we done now with building bike lanes? No, because we don't have a complete network. So don't build it one at a time, is my major message to city. Do what Calgary, which I've already said is a lot like you, did, which is to build a pilot of a minimum grid in the downtown. Do, in my opinion, the best urban pilot that I've seen done on bike lanes, and turn your conservative or anti-bike lane politicians away from that position to being supportive of this, which is what Calgary managed to do. And if they can do it, you can do it. And then their neighbor, because competition is a really big thing, saw the success of Calgary, Edmonton, Alberta, and said, well, we want to do it better and we want to up them. We're not even going to do it as a pilot. We're just going to build the network, which is what they've done this year. So 2 right-wing conservative cities have built 2 of the best immediate bike infrastructure networks in the inner city. And that's what you should be doing. As you look at your bike master plan that's being done, don't pull the Band-Aid off slowly. Build a minimum grid. And then transit. You've been doing very interesting things in terms of reorganizing your transit allocation, largely because you had to. in the context of big hits to your operating funds. And that's increased ridership. You've done some really impressive things there, but you're now in the state where you should be getting to the next level of public transit. This is the frequent transit network in Vancouver. These is just buses that run frequently, under 10-minute headways. And it's basically the whole city, whereas you've got a few routes that you do that in. So how you get to the point where it is ubiquitous, before you even talk about things like light rail or bus rapid transit, is key. You know, you've gone through this exercise where you're getting rid of your curvilinear, wiggly types of things, which is about coverage, and getting to your ridership model. Because if you only have finite amount of transit, which you should be increasing your investment in public transit. But in the meantime, you need to reorganize and prioritize for ridership, which you've done in some cases, moving away from that to moving to this. This is how you get the gains in terms of mode shift, which has to be your highest priority, moving from that to that. This is Halifax, which has been doing the same kind of exercise. Really, really important. I'll skip past goods movement and talk about the car. Even when it comes to the car, what's your innovation relative to that? I've been asking questions about car share. We've had some conversations about that. The most interesting thing about car share, in my opinion, is this, the space effect that it has. Every car share space replaces 20 vehicles taking up space, moving around in your roads, needing parking in your city or in your downtown. So it's a space saver. Car share working with public transit is really, really powerful. This is what it really comes down to. How much space you're allocating for this, where all of this gets squashed. That's not really freedom. That's not really equity. That's not really smart. Mayors are loving doing this. I collect these. This is one of the first one in Munster, Germany. Now mayors actually, because they know I tweet these, send them to me when they take their picture. The point of this is it's about space, and this even undersells the point because this is space when the cars aren't moving. The actual space needed when these cars are moving, the separation between cars is obviously dramatically more. But it makes the point that how you get around, the number one implication in cities is how much space it takes up. My clients in Santiago, Chile did this recently, where they made the extra point that not only is there a big space difference, but when your bus is stuck in the same traffic, you've got all these people stuck in the same traffic as all of these. So they made an extra point in the photo. So they win. This is the best one, I think. But it really makes the point for separated bus lanes. You're holding up all of these people because of this. Or you can do it in a clever way, even doing bike parking. There's all sorts of ways to make the point that mobility in cities is about space. Space and movement, space and parking, etc. None of this is anti-car. I want this to really, this is probably my most important slide. What we have found, smart cities around the world have found, is when you do this, it works better for everyone. If you design a city for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers, because those cities are choking in traffic. You're trying to move everybody by car in their big object in a finite amount of space, even with your wide roads, and your traffic is getting worse. I've heard it here that it used to be a 15-minute city, now it's a 25-minute city in terms of how you get around. So even in your city, traffic is getting worse in that context. If you design a multimodal city, it works better for everyone, including drivers. Notice the repetition. This is not an anti-driver message. This is not an anti-car message. This is a pro-city, pro-people message, where it actually works better for everyone. You know, I always have, when I do public lectures, I have a lady say in the Q&A, but Brent, you don't understand, here's my life. And they will describe their week and say, I absolutely can't do that without a car. So how can you possibly want to try to force me out of my car? And I say, there's no conversation we're having that is about forcing you out of your car. But trust me when I say, because I understand geometry, that the best thing for you is that your neighbor walks and your other neighbor takes public transit and your other neighbor rides a bike. Because if you're all driving, none of you are moving particularly well. That's got to be the nature of the conversation. This is not an anti-car message. This is not a war on the car. This is about cities working better for everyone. Anything else is lazy narrative to get clicks or political votes. I'm probably getting close to my time. How am I doing? Okay. The second criteria for density done well is having a high design standard. What you expect of developers, what you expect of yourself in terms of the quality of urban design in your city. In Vancouver, we have probably the highest standard for design in North America. Not because we like aesthetics. I'm not talking about beautification. I'm talking about value creation. I actually did this slide for the mayor of Sydney, Australia, because they were having a debate about, whether you could afford design. And the point I was making is that smart cities understand that design isn't superficial. It's about value creation. Public sector value creation, saving costs, public costs, return on investment, private sector investment in terms of return on investment on projects and sustaining a marketplace over time, even if you have a dip like 2008. The track record is very clear that cities that do their urban design better outperform from an economic perspective, plus all of the other perspectives. But if all you're interested in is economics, better designed cities outperform. And I won't read these out, but you can read them, all the different ways where the studies show urban design outperforms. And I put it really simply. Beauty outperforms ugly. And it's remarkable how expensive ugly can be. I talk a lot in cities about height because Vancouver is known as a tall building city. I happen to find these towers to be monotonous and boring. But what's important about this is the idea that we do towers in a way that's separated. See, you can see you're going through the entire downtown and you can still see the mountains in Vancouver. One of our narratives has been we want our city building to be connected to our setting, which is a beautiful setting, as is yours. And we also say that, the old saying used to be that Vancouver was a setting in search of a city. And then the narrative became, how do we build a city that's worthy of our setting? And I understand your mayor has used similar language in that. That's a high standard when your setting is as beautiful as Vancouver's. And you don't have the obvious water advantage, but you sure have the mountains, like we do. So height is an interesting thing if you're actually trying to attract a market to urban living. I say that if the reason people want to buy a condo up here is because we have great views to the mountains, great. As long as they ride down the elevator, which is a form of public transit, and walk their kids to school and walk to the grocery store instead of driving their car everywhere. If it's the view that got them, then use the view. You've got a great view here. You can use that to build your marketplace for urban living if you're not afraid of height. I work in a lot of places where there's fear of height, there's dogma around height. I've heard architects say that there's a special level of hell dedicated for architects who design buildings over 6 stories, which is ridiculous. The key is to design every scale well. I've seen beautifully and successfully designed tall buildings, and I've seen horribly designed mid-rise buildings and badly designed low-rise buildings. Design is the variable, not height. And yet, almost all of our conversation, too often, is about how tall the building is. I haven't been in your city long enough to know whether that's the issue here, but that's certainly what I found in other cities. How the building lands in a way that has a human scale, a podium. Vancouver basically initiated the podium and point tower concept. Now it's being copied all over the world, often really badly. But the principle of it is to have a human-scaled podium that creates the enclosure on the street, which facilitates walkability, all the thing that urbanists that like mid-rise like, but then the towers are stepped back and separated from each other and don't overwhelm your perspective of scale and height. So my predecessor says that they float out of the perception of the walker, and it is the mid-rise that creates the actual experience for the walker. But the towers give you extra body heat, where people are riding down the elevator and participating in all the supports and services in the city. So it's the combination of height and mid-rise to create human scale and body heat. Or you could just do vertical sprawl, which is tall towers stepped back in a suburban context with no relationship to the street, and everybody rides down the elevator, gets into their car in the parking garage, and vomits out onto the expressway. There's a really big difference between those two things, and it's about how the tall building is designed and how the neighborhood is designed, not about how many floors the building has. You get my point? Okay. if you're interested in tall versus good urbanism, read this article. You can Google that title. Everything I believe about tall buildings is in there. The third element of density done well is, as you densify, where are your amenities? Where are your supports? Where are the things that make it livable and lovable, so you're not just packing people in and straining support on existing amenities and such. Your challenge in America, I find, is that a lot of the tools that other cities are using, like density bonusing, which leverages the market to build the kind of amenities, whether it's parks and public spaces, civic spaces, heritage restoration, retention and restoration, daycare for families, school sites, obviously for schools, all the kind of public realm and community and civic and cultural and heritage infrastructure that city halls would never be able to afford. Even Canadian cities, which tax more than yours do, I guarantee you, your cities can't afford them. And that's why you have challenges around bond measures and such for things. We leverage density to pay for them. But there is an ideological issue which seems to be unique to the United States as far as I can tell, which is you don't want regulations and such to intervene in the marketplace. So you let your developers build density without negotiating from them all these things that actually makes density successful. Not all American cities. Seattle is doing what I'm talking about. New York is doing what I'm talking about. San Francisco to some extent. Some other cities. So it's not unheard of in the United States. But trust me when I say other cities in the world are doing this a lot more than you, and they're achieving density with the amenities that make density successful better than American cities are. There are a lot of cases where I give an answer. This is a prime example of where I get we could never do that in our city, because they will explain to me usually the ideology about why this just isn't possible here. But if you want your densification to be successful, and you're not willing to tax, and you can't necessarily always be successful on bond measures, how are you going to pay for it? What other cities do is leverage development. And by the way, it doesn't break the profitability of projects, because what it does is lower land price. And developers can actually buy land for cheaper because there's a clear expectation to provide this in the context of development. I can talk for a day on just this, and I'm not going to. But my point is, if you don't have the mechanisms in place to get the amenities and the supports and the services, you don't get families because you don't have daycare. You don't get heritage preservation, so you have a debate about whether or not you are just tearing everything down to build new buildings. You have a hard time keeping up on your parks and your green space and all the things that actually make density reasonably supportable. So it's really, really tough to succeed without it. So those are my three elements of density done well. Mobility and land use aligned. Prioritization of walking, biking, and transit is point one. Point two is a high design standard, an expectation of excellence in design, both public and private sector. And the third is amenities and supports that actually make density successful and livable and lovable. And then that gets translated into density at every scale. Tall buildings, mid-rise buildings, low-rise buildings. We get a reputation in Vancouver for doing tall buildings. Most of our city doesn't allow tall buildings. Most of the geographic area of the city, you're not allowed to do a tall building. And we always have height limits. We talked today about the problem you have of, ironically, having no height limits in your downtown. Because if you have no height limits, how much is the land worth? And developers have a hard time knowing how much to pay for land and actually make transactions happen. So you've got a problem of having too loose planning regulations, is one observation I had today. But in Vancouver, we design height, we design density. We give clarity to the marketplace on what's being allowed to be built so that they can price land accordingly. They factor in that they have to give us the amenities that make that actually work. And thus they don't overpay for land. And our developers make way more profit than your developers do. So none of this is socialism. This is all capitalism. And we do our mid-rise really well. Most of the attention is about tall buildings. How you design the mid-rise, I think generally you folks are doing pretty good mid-rise, I have to say. And I have a high standard, so that's high praise from me. But it doesn't mean you couldn't be improving it. And we're talking about a culture of getting to the next level of design quality with the private sector. We learned a lot. I told you about our Athletes Village. This is our Athletes Village in Vancouver. As you can see, it's a mid-rise project, not a high-rise project. We wanted to show the world we did mid-rise really well. The public realm, the quality of the public spaces, and it's the greenest community in North America, including to your Green Building Council, the US Green Building Council, which gave it the highest LEED ND points ever given. Still, 8 years from now, it's still the highest ever given. Passive design, natural ventilation, natural heating and cooling and lighting, externalizing the staircases, externalizing the corridors so that you don't have to heat and cool them. We dropped the energy use by 30% right off the bat just by remembering how to design buildings better before there was air conditioning and before there was a perception of cheap energy. Of course, it's Vancouver, so we collected rain, but we also did solar, which was felt to be non-viable in Vancouver, and we proved that wrong. But most importantly, a district energy system that took all the heating of the space and the potable water and the water off the grid, out of the carbon footprint scenario by essentially capturing the waste heat from sewers, wrapping them and capturing that waste heat, hot poop basically, and taking that as an energy source and taking it all off the grid. This is the largest district energy system in North America, and it's not even that high tech. So it's not even hard to do this. Whatever your district energy technology is, biomass, geothermal, there's all sorts of technologies. We're just not making them business as usual by expecting that developers will build them. So nice design, highly designed projects at every scale with no scale dogma, no dogma about tall buildings, just a clarity on where they're allowed and where they're not, and how tall from an urban design perspective. That's how not just Vancouver, but frankly the cities in my observation that are doing this well are doing it. While we're talking about density, because I'm so interested in the suburbs and even the evolution of inner city low density neighborhoods, my friend in California, Dan Perolik, coined this term the missing middle, the housing between the single detached house and even the mid-rise, let alone the high-rise. All these kinds of housing forms that in many cases are illegal. I think they're illegal in your R1. You allow some in your R2, I've learned today. But generally speaking, we don't allow these very much. And there's this really strong interest in the marketplace for housing choices, freedom, if you will, to choose your housing types, many of which are ground-oriented. And it's not that this replaces this, but a good city has places for this, and places for this, and places for this. But there's a reason why it's called the missing middle. A lot of this is illegal. In Vancouver, when I was doing the eco-density initiative, I called it gentle density. The point being that you could do this and not really change the feel and character of low-density neighborhoods particularly much. And I used words like hidden and invisible density to talk about, we did Laneway Housing. We're blessed by lane infrastructure, separated, you call them ADUs, accessory dwelling units. I called them, they were called coach houses. I called them Fonzie suites because Fonzie lives above the garage, like you've done in some cases in American cities. I called it hidden density though because it's tucked in behind. You can do it as a side drive in the back of your lot, or you can do it off the rear lane. But it's a separate, detachable, rentable unit or a granny suite or a flexible unit. Or you can do secondary suites, which in our case we allow in the primary house. So I called it invisible density because literally it's still the same house from the outside. It just has a rentable unit in the basement or maybe not in the basement. So these kinds of housing options can give you more population density or just return the population density to where it used to be, because in many cases our inner city neighborhoods are actually depopulating. As the empty nesters, the kids have left, but the empty nesters don't want to leave because they love their neighborhood. And you actually have fewer people living in the neighborhood, fewer kids specifically, and maybe your school is under threat of closure. This became the conversation for a lot of these housing types actually stabilizing neighborhoods, as opposed to destabilizing them, which is often the common narrative. You can keep the school there. You can return kids to the neighborhood. You can repopulate the neighborhood. And you can allow grandparents as empty neighbors and empty nesters to have their kids and their grandkids in the same neighborhood instead of living way the heck out or in some other city because they can't afford to find a place to live in your city. These are the kinds of narratives I heard from real people listening to the conversation about change. But we coin phrases to describe types of density that have nothing to do with mid-rises, let alone high-rises. There's lots of different housing forms you can talk about. So Dan called it the missing middle. I called it gentle, hidden, and invisible density. And if you think these ideas are small, I remember people telling me the Laneway Housing is such a small idea. It's literally these kinds of units in the backyard. How much is that really going to change? We have over 2,500 of them approved since we put them in the zoning in Vancouver. So it's a small idea, but it has transformed neighborhoods because it makes neighborhoods more nimble for these kinds of transformations over time. We call it aging in place. It's more nimble for families to have their kids close in one context, have a mortgage helper when they're younger and for buying their first house, all sorts of different scenarios where your neighborhoods and your choices are more nimble, you have more freedom. If you think that density as a conversation is really tough in your politics, in your communities, I've heard a lot of that today, but in places like Vancouver it's easy, I get that a lot. It's not true. You know, this is a pretty common headline in Vancouver. And this is what the Not in My Backyards come up with in Vancouver. This is a poster that a community group did when we proposed to change a transit-supported arterial from 4 stories to 5 stories. 1 floor. They're pretty good at graphics, as you can see. But this is the kind of narrative that can happen. So it's never easy. And there's no city in the world that I've seen where this is an easy conversation. So just because you think it's hard here, that doesn't make you unique. But the cities that are doing it are having better conversations. We talked a lot today about the nature and the quality of the conversation about change in Colorado Springs. What I'd like to get to, you know this term "not in my backyard," which is the lazy pejorative that often gets put out. I don't really like the term, because when people are telling me what they're afraid of when it comes to change, which is human nature to be afraid of change, they're giving me intelligence and information that can allow me to make the outcome better, because I know what they're afraid of. So NIMBY isn't the problem. The problem are politicians, sorry for the politicians in the audience, who listen to some NIMBYs and say no to things that they know is right. That's the problem. The problem with NIMBY is when you say no to things that you need to do because of NIMBY. What you should be doing is listening to NIMBY and learning from it to get better results. So from NIMBY to QUIMBY is what I call it. This is quality in my backyard. This is not a yes, YIMBY, as it's now called. It's not a no, NIMBY. It's having a conversation about how to build all of it better. And the mature cities, the cities with a culture and a confidence, are having the conversation about the quality of growth, not whether you grow or not, which is a very simple black or white kind of thing. So that is that's the extent of my conversation with you tonight about growth and density and transportation. I want to end with just a few ideas that I decided to put in because of my observations today and even some of the small inspirations I saw. While you're planning and designing the big city that you need to be more sustainable, to be more healthy, to connect your Olympic City brand with a healthy city model, we talked a lot about that today. In the meantime, there's a lot of really cool, simple, fast things that you could be doing that makes your city better tomorrow and the next day. And the way I put it is, there's a lot of really simple ideas out there that could strengthen our cities. It's remarkable how hard we make simple things. That's about culture. That's about saying yes to things or getting out of the way of innovation. And just a few examples. My clients in Auckland, New Zealand, in advance of the transformation, long-term transformation of the Auckland waterfront, they had a lot of really bad surface parking lots on their waterfront, and they wanted to connect it where the first phases where the first phases of the transformation would happen. And literally overnight, they built this boulevard at the edge of the parking lot. And all they did overnight was parking and planters. That's all they did. And suddenly, people came. Really easy, really cheap, really fast, and successful. Food trucks. Simple. This is not about competition with restaurants. This isn't a commerce thing. This is a placemaking thing. How you can fill gaps in your wide streets, for example. If you didn't change the curb lines of your streets at all, but took some of that parking and in the summer or periodically transformed one of your streets into a food truck street, as Portland did with its surface parking lots in its downtown, you could create something that actually attracts people. Parking doesn't attract people. Things attract people that are interesting. And so something as simple as food trucks are a placemaker. Another placemaker are containers, where you fill, as I showed you in that example in Brisbane, you fill the gaps in the dead spaces in your downtown. You can do this really quick. I get from people, well, we don't want to do containers. That's so cheap. That's so lowbrow. Don't you understand, Brent, that we're a sophisticated downtown? This is New York. This is Helsinki. This is Oslo. This is Christchurch, which used them to address the fact that they lost 80% of their building stock in the earthquake. And they are really good at gap filling there. But I say you don't need an earthquake to recognize that you have gaps in your urban pattern. And this is Halifax in Canada. So there are examples in rich and poor cities where this is done. And it's not intended to be the permanent outcome, but it fills the gaps in the meantime. Another example is parklets. Have you had that conversation here? I found that cities have parklets, and they say to me, well, Brent, but there's the parklet. It's right there. You have one. Good news, Brent. We're going to double it next year. We're going to have two. You have, how many surface parking spaces do you have in your downtown? Yeah. It's not a test. Don't worry. But you can be doing a lot more. I don't show this to you because it's a new idea. I show this to you because it's a well-established idea that you should be doing a lot more of. And when you put all these ideas together, you start to rethink those incredibly wide streets you have. You rethink all your gaps in your urban pattern and your dead spaces. And you make your downtown way cooler. Like, I've heard a lot about the nature and the branding of your downtown today. You could transform it within a season if you had the kind of culture to think about it in this way. Planning the temporary city. And as I said, you already have some examples to learn from. And then in the meantime, have some fun. I tweeted your public art piece that tells you you're good and smart and people like you. That social affirmation. Is that what it's called? Affirmation Station? It just made me smile. And I collect these, and I put them in under the hashtag City of Smiles. So if you go on Twitter and search hashtag City of Smiles, you'll see a lot of them, because I've encouraged other people to do it. It's all the stuff that happens in the between when we don't take ourselves so seriously and we get out of our own way and we create a culture of creativity and experimentation in our downtown and across our city. That is it. Is Colorado Springs ready to expect better in its city building? And Susan liked my hashtag in my tweet last night. It's the first time I ever used it, but there it is, Urban Mojo. Do you have the confidence to know that you're ready to expect better and not be so focused on your old historic attention to the boom and bust cycle, not psycho. Thanks very much.